Okay, so we're looking at the temporal summation. In other words, stimulating at least twice, more than one time. One time produces the twitch, but if I stimulate it more than one time, then I'm actually going to add to my original twitch as long as I stimulate before the contraction totally reaches the beginning point. All right, so notice that on this picture, I didn't have too much relaxation time. I had a little bit, but actually, if I stimulated, which means basically I caused that latent period to release more calcium ions, and I did it before this first stimulus had actually been allowed to relax too much. So this time period between when I reach this peak and when the relaxation occurs and when I stimulate it again created more of a tension, more of a stair-step effect. So the less time I take between the stimuli, then the less time relaxation occurs and the higher the tension gains of my contraction. Notice here my relaxation cycle was even less, so my tension was even more. Well, since I didn't stimulate it again, then I was allowed to go through a full relaxation cycle. But again, notice how the sooner that I stimulate this before it starts relaxing, the higher the tension and the longer I'm going to maintain the contraction. Okay, notice here we actually allowed more relaxation, so when we stimulated it again instead of the last time we stimulated it during 50 milliseconds of time, this time we waited 70 milliseconds before we stimulated again. So during this time interval we were relaxing. Since we waited longer, then we didn't get near as much tension build up, and then of course we didn't stimulate anymore, so we allowed a full contraction. Notice here again we almost had a full contraction, so we almost got a totally different instead of having a temporal summation, if we would have allowed that to go ahead and go all the way back down to the original beginning tension, then we would, instead of having a summation of those two, a temporal summation, we would have just had two separate contractions, two separate twitches. Here we see we waited 110 milliseconds, so we gave this enough time to totally relax before we stimulated again, so that would be one twitch. Then if we stimulated it again during this time period, 110 milliseconds, then we have to start all over, and instead of having a summation, we literally again get two separate twitches. Okay, here we see a graph that we need to understand. We see basically the tension that's gained, so the higher up, the greater the tension. We actually see the stimulus down here. So here's our temporal summation. So notice how these lines keep getting closer and closer together, which means every time you see a line, that's like a stimulus. And once they get closer and closer together, it means that we are sending the action potential, the stimulus, to the muscle faster, 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 faster. Well, we know that if we increase the or decrease the time between our stimuli, then we get that stair-step effect that we talked about on the earlier graph. It's just this time, instead of just stimulating it once or stimulating it twice, now we're stimulating it multiple times, which is what actually happens in an actual muscle contraction. So as I stimulate it multiple times, what we're seeing here, instead of seeing like the curve in the picture, we're seeing an up, and then this portion right here would be the relaxation cycles. So notice that as we stimulate faster and faster and faster, we increase the tension, but we decrease the relaxation till eventually we only have tension. We've got our maximum tension here, but we don't have any relaxation time. But then notice eventually then we can't hold that tension forever. So here's where our fatigue finally comes in. And of course that happens. Fatigue is a result of several things. Main thing being lactic acid, but also being the lack of ATP. So let's talk about the different sections of this graph, and hopefully we understand. Here's a contraction, relaxation, contraction, relaxation, contraction, relaxation. Notice that in these first 5 stimuli that we had a total relaxation because we see a straight line, and we had a slight decrease in tension. But what we had here was equal distance between our stimulus. Okay, but notice our stimulus gets getting closer and closer together. That's why it's a solid dark line, because it's so close together we can't see any space, any space between, meaning that we're just stimulating it over and over and over and over, faster and faster and faster. Okay, again, we had a build in tension or contraction, and then our relaxation cycles got less. So again, we get the stair-step effect of contraction, relaxation, contraction, relaxation, contraction, relaxation, till eventually we only have contraction and no relaxation. Now let's talk about what we call each of these different steps. Okay, when we look at this and look at the different steps, notice the first 5 stimuli, which had equal amount of distance and timing before we stimulated it again, was called treppe. And so we stimulated, had a certain amount of time stimulated, and each time we stimulated, we had a certain amount of tension gain, then a full relaxation. Certain amount of tension gain, full relaxation. Certain amount of tension gain, full relaxation. Now, notice we do get a slight rise in the tension here, but that's not due to the increased stimuli, because the increased stimuli is what we call temporal summation. That's simply due to the warming up of the muscles and some of the enzymes that are active at that time. Okay, but now what we're doing during this time period called temporal summation is we are increasing the speed of each contraction. So each of these lines means we're contracting, we're releasing our neurotransmitter faster. Therefore, our contraction is actually increasing. Our tension is increasing. We have a increase in a relaxation. We stimulate faster, bigger tension increase, partial relaxation, till finally, and of course during this period where we are actually having, instead of a full relaxation, our relaxation periods get less, but our tension keeps gaining until we get our maximum tension. We're in something called incomplete tetanus at this point, where there is some relaxation after an increase in tension. Finally, when we don't get any more relaxation period, but we're ahead of maximum tension, we are in what's called complete tetanus. All right, so complete tetanus, maximum tension, we're still stimulating faster. Well, we can only hold that for so long till eventually we start decreasing our tension, even though we may still be stimulating it. And again, because especially if we're in our white muscle fibers, we're definitely starting to build up a lot of lactic acid, and so our fatigue starts setting in. And then, of course, if we use up our ATP, then we no longer have an ability to power our power stroke of the myosin cross bridges. Okay, now look what happens when we click on treppe.
Contractions demonstrate treppe, or the staircase effect. Look closely to see that even though the strength of contraction increased, relaxation was complete. This shows that temporal summation was not responsible for this effect. The increase in tension may result from increased muscle warming and efficiency of enzymes. Click the stimulator to see muscle activity during treppe, then click another region of the graph. After the first 5 stimuli, the frequency was increased, which caused temporal summation. Notice that this resulted in a continual increase in tension as one contraction was added to the previous contraction. The increase in tension may result from increased availability of intracellular calcium. Click the stimulator to see muscle activity during temporal summation.
So again here, during incomplete tetanus, notice we increase our stimulus, our tension builds, our relaxation cycles shorten. In complete tetanus, No more relaxation, even though our temporal summation is still at work. We're still stimulating faster, faster, faster. And then finally, so again, that's really going ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta, and no relaxation cycles. Finally, we get to the point of fatigue, and again, with the buildup of lactic acid and the lack of ATP, then eventually we're not going to be able to hold that full contraction, so our tension has to drop, even though we still may be stimulating. Okay, let's look at the length-tension relationship. In other words, here again we can see in this, our Z lines would be back here holding our thin filaments. Here's our thick filaments, so there's our H zone that we keep talking about. Here's our cross bridges. It's going to grab the binding sites and pull the thin filaments. So how does the stretch of our muscle affect the tension that we can gain? Okay, so there are three conditions here would be unstretched muscle, moderately stretched muscle, and overstretched muscle. Well, here we see that we have moderately stretched muscle, which is the ideal amount of stretching to produce the most tension, because we have the greatest amount of surface area that the cross bridges can grab the binding sites, and the greatest amount of area that it can pull this to produce the most tension. So notice we get the greatest amount of tension from moderately stretched muscle because of the positioning of the actin or the thin filaments with the myosin. We'll look at overstretched muscle. In other words, it's so stretched that the thin filaments are barely in position for the thick filaments to cross bridges to grab them, so we're not going to be able to produce much of a tension with this. Again, since we can't pull them very far, we get a very little tension on this because we're so stretched. Now, in living specimens, it's hard for it to ever get this overstretched in skeletal muscle, because skeletal muscle is attached to bone, so in order to stretch it that much, you literally have to break the bones. But in muscle like cardiac muscle, then sometimes when people get enlarged hearts, they get the muscle in the heart so enlarged due to different factors, then you can literally create congestive heart failure if your heart muscle is overstretched to where you can't create the tension that the heart would need to do, because when the heart creates tension, it does it so it can literally squeeze the blood out of the heart. So you have to have all these muscle cells coordinating this with each other, but if you can't contract it, then it doesn't do you any good. Okay, so look at this unstretched example where, basically my muscle is, the thin filaments are basically almost overlapping with each other. So my H zone has pretty much disappeared. So when my cross bridges grab it, I don't really have very far that I can pull these because they're already overlapping each other. So let's look at the tension that would create. Again, here was the tension created by the moderately stretched, where I can pull these a good distance. And then this, I actually can pull it just a little bit. So here is the tension that can be created from this. But remember, we had very little tension created that was able to be generated from an overstretched muscle. So obviously moderately stretched is the ideal situation. Unstretched, we can get a little bit of tension, but not a lot. But overly stretched, then we can't get barely any tension according to how overstretched it is. Okay, let's look at this chart and the definitions real quick. Of course, the first thing on here is actually called treppe, increased muscle tension due to muscle warming and increased efficiency of the enzyme, not due to temporal summation. Temporal summation was this whole section down here, increasing the levels of tension due to the repeated stimulation. Okay, we had incomplete tetanus, which is this up here, which was short, rapid contraction relaxation cycles due to the higher frequency of the stimulation. We had complete tetanus right here due to the continuous without any relaxation period. And then finally we had fatigue here due to the gradual